Hey everybody, I'm Ryan. This is Roll for Initiative, and I want to invite you to come back to the 1980s again with me on this story update and GM diaries for the game that I'm running in Tales from the Loop, which is a system put out by Modifius. So if you watched the other video about Tales from the Loop, you'll know that this is a game set in Sweden in the 1980s that never was. The idea is that sort of maglev technology and fission and fusion and all kinds of technological advances happened in the 1950s. And then we jump forward 3 decades, and there are these huge particle accelerators that are in Sweden and in Colorado in the United States. And our game takes place in Sweden. So this story is following the exploits of 3 kids, Freaky, Alice, and Hildegard. So I'll give you a bit of an update of who each of those characters are and where they're at in the story, plus a little insight into what I'm learning as IGM and some tips and tricks for you if you decide to run a game of Tales for yourself. So first of all, our characters. Dawn is playing a character named Alice. Now, Alice is the weirdo, and I'm not being mean. That's the sort of character class in this game. You have all of the different types of kids that you meet in school. And Alice is a weirdo. She's a little bit of an outsider. She has a brother who is acting very strange and refuses to come out of his room and having trouble at school. Our friend Pierce, and you can follow him online as Sorcerer Blob. He is playing Freaky. Freaky is a jock. He's the captain of the hockey team, and he doesn't have a very good home life. His mom died a few years ago, and his dad copes with that by drinking a lot and is pretty abusive. This is a game where you play kids, but there are still some fairly grown-up themes and adult ideas that run throughout it, if that's how you want to play. Sometimes our game gets a little bit heavy, but then it bounces back into that sort of situational thriller type thing that you see with movies like It or shows like Stranger Things. And lastly, our friend Alyssa is playing Hildegard. Hildegard is a smarty pants. She wants to be the smartest person in school, and she finds out in this episode that she's the second smartest person in school. She applied for a couple of different tech summer camps that she really wanted to be a part of. Her home life is pretty good, but she often finds herself being forced to watch after her little sister. All right, so the story this far. Our first session started on the first day back to school from a break. And so we went one scene at a time as I would ask them, who has a scene, who wants to start, and does it have anything to do with your pride or your troubles or your family or your relationships? We followed as Freaky tried to sneak out of his house, collecting a couple of tools so that they could fix up their hideout. He ended up getting caught, and that kind of spooked him pretty bad, caught by his dad. And so he hopped on his bike and rode his bike off to school. We then went over to Alice, who was trying to get her brother to come down for breakfast, and he wouldn't do it. And then she was off to school. And lastly, Hildegard, who was dealing with her little sister and getting her little sister ready and to school on time. And that went pretty all right from there. Once all 3 characters were at school, I think it's important to spend some time with the boring and mundane aspects of everyday life. That's one of the rules for playing Tales from the Loop. And we talked about that in our last video, is that everyday life is boring and normal. I think that it's worth spending a little bit of time when you run your Tales campaign to play those things out. What is it like moving from class to class to class? Now, you can speed that sort of thing up. I sort of did that. I had them start in a home room with their biology teacher, and a few things happened. Then they jumped to lunch, and then they jumped back to the end of the day. The reason I think that that's important as a GM is because when you spend a little bit of time on the boring, mundane, day-to-day stuff, when things start to get a little strange and weird and extraordinary, they stand out a little bit more. So our 3 players were in school. They heard about a couple of high school sort of drama. There was some romance breakup, and Alice's brother still was skipping school. They found out that the school was giving vaccines that they needed to be in line for at the nurse's office. Two of the players signed up to help with the school dance, and they all agreed to meet with another friend of theirs, and this was an NPC, another friend of theirs after school to play a new board game. He had gotten a board game, Terror Tower, which was based off of a game that I used to play a lot whenever I was a kid, and they actually are re-releasing it. I found this out when I was at Gen Con this year. Called Dark Tower, where there is a large plastic electronic tower in the middle of the game board, and you move around the board trying to win the game, and the tower keeps track of where all of your pieces are. I used to play that game as a kid, and the kids in Tales from the Loop were playing it as well. Unfortunately, the game wrapped up, our first session wrapped up, with the three player characters, Alice, Freaky, and Hildegard, waking up in the middle of the night out in the forest. They were covered in bruises and scratches and bumps and all kinds of things. Alice was kind of freaking out as she was creeping through the woods. She saw a shape of someone with a big stick, and she was really worried that he was going to hurt her, so she was trying to sneak around. Meanwhile, the other player, Pierce, who was playing Freaky, heard someone moving around in the woods. Now, this was a nice moment where my players really took the idea of yes and they ran with it. They understood that this game is played from the perspective of kids. Now, kids aren't stupid and kids aren't naive, but in the world of Tales from the Loop, it thrives on the idea that kids accept the wondrous parts of the world. Freaky, being played by Pierce, remembered all of the stories of the mutants that were in the forest and was terrified that there was a mutant wolf out there. And my players actually played a little bit of combat. Now, it was PvP, technically. It was Alice who couldn't quite make out Freaky, and it was Freaky who didn't realize that it was Alice and not some kind of crazy wolf. They rolled off, and it turns out that Alice was just a little bit quicker. Ultimately, a search party found them, but not before they were really scared by Alex, another school kid who ran at them screaming and then immediately dropped into a coma. That was pretty much our episode 1. I'm going pretty quick through that, but just to catch you up a little bit on the story. I know a number of you that watched that first one said you were interested in what was going on with all of the characters. Episode 2 picked up a couple of days afterwards. We started with the 3 children sitting in a conference room in the hospital. And in the room with them was the sheriff of the town that they live in, Stenhammer. The sheriff was an out-of-touch, normal adult and kind of didn't believe the kids when they said that they were worried about rumors and wild animals and mutants and all of the strange things that were happening all around town. The sheriff was just there to ask them again what was going on, tried to sort of adult-splain things to them as the NPC sheriff was trying to figure out what had happened to Alex, why he was in a coma, and what had happened to one of the other kids who had gone missing a number of days before. From here, the kids realized that they had the day off of school, and they all went back to Hildegard's parents' house in order to hang out. They were given the day off of school, and Hildegard invited Alice and Freaky over. Freaky couldn't go home because his dad had gotten really mad at one of the other children's parents and, well, wound up being in jail for a couple of days. Now, as a GM, I used that as a tool to try to keep my party together. As I talked about in a previous video, Tales from the Loop sometimes does lend itself to splitting the party, which isn't the best thing in the world. At least, not for me. I don't enjoy that. So I had the parent being in custody and the Freaky not being able to go home as a way to keep all of these kids together at one person's house. Essentially, they had a sleepover. And from there, the players decided what it is that they wanted to do. Freaky went home in order to get a couple of things packed up and in order to get a couple of extra tools, and then they went back to Hildegard's house. They hung out there and they formulated a plan to go back to the woods. They wanted to try and see if they could find anything else out as far as what was going on. The next day they went back to school and things went kind of normally until lunchtime. By the time they got back to lunch, Alice's brother showed up and was acting very, very strange. Now, throughout the story, I had been telling my players, as well as my players contributing to the story, that the brother was locking himself in his room a lot. They did decide to try to play some video games. They had snuck into his room at one point, and there was a work table that was covered with a blanket. At that point, this was a challenge test, and so Dawn had Alice trying to look underneath that, and so she rolled her off of her stat and was able to get a good look underneath, but didn't really roll well enough. She didn't get enough successes to figure out exactly what it was, and so we had this sort of complicated success where, yeah, even though she failed, she isn't just told no. I think that's an important thing to do with Tales from the Loop. What I just told her was it looked like the garage door opener and a telephone and a bunch of parts from Radio Shack had been assembled into something, but she couldn't figure out what it was. So when her brother showed up at lunch and was acting very strange, he was sticking his arm out and didn't quite understand what a handshake was right away, and was calling everyone by their full name, as well as mentioning his relationship with them. For example, saying, well, yeah, I'll see you later, Freaky Magnuson, captain of the hockey team. I will see you later, Alice, my sister. Talking and acting very strange. So that sort of led into some of the in-character conversations. Eventually they found themselves back to their hideout deep in the forest and searching the grounds. They did really well and happened across some footprints. Now this was the moment where my players finally focused in on one of 3 story tracks I had laid breadcrumbs out for. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the other 2 were because I probably will use them in a later story, and it's certainly possible that they could still show up. But finally, they had focused in on one, and I knew where the rest of the story was definitely going. They rolled really well and were able to choose some additional information because of the bonus successes they had rolled, to find not only tracks, but able to figure out, to deduce the fact that these were tracks made by some sort of large reptile that was walking on 2 legs. The feet almost looked like gecko feet, and they could figure out that they were pressed into the mud enough that the gecko was probably carrying something pretty heavy, a good maybe 80 or 90 pounds. They followed the tracks until they got to a tunnel that went underground. They crawled through that for a little while, and it opened up to a large metal door. They weren't able to open the door, but after digging around, they found a shred of the shirt of the missing boy, and they had figured it out, that these strange lizard things must have kidnapped the young boy who had gone missing. They went back home, put together a plan, worked together in order to build a tool in order to open this door. They came back the next day, and we finally had a boss fight. Honestly, that's kind of what it was. This was one of the things that Tales from the Loop does that I really like. It's what's called the extended trouble. Normally, a regular trouble arises from the scene. It only requires 1 success to pass, and the scene moves forward. But with the extended trouble, I set the scene for them ahead of time and told them very specifically what the consequences of failure were going to be, as well as how many successes they needed. Now for this one, the heavy metal door, if they didn't get it open this time, it was never going to be able to open again. The tool they had made would break, and it would break in such a way that this door would remain sealed. I also told them instead of one success, they needed 3 successes per player. So they needed a total of 9. And this became something where they then formulated their own plan and told me how they were going to try to do stuff, what stats they wanted to use, and one at a time they rolled. They got around the table and they only had 6 successes. But with Tales from the Loop, you were able to tap in and use your luck to re-roll failed things, or take on a negative condition in order to give you 1 success. The way that it ended up working is that all of the children took on a condition. They were either exhausted or frightened or injured in a certain way. And that's what got them to their 9 successes. And storytelling-wise, it was a really tense moment, and everyone was leaning forward over the dice and figuring it out. It was just as crazy as any boss fight that I've had in D&D, but it was them trying to figure out how to open this door. Once it opened, Alice and the rest of the group snuck forward. Alice went by herself a little while where they found an exact replica of their town, built in a large subterranean cavern and inhabited entirely by brightly colored lizard people. Now, earlier in that day, the rector, the principal of their school, had sort of freaked out at Hildegard when he caught her in his office and grabbed her very tightly by the arm and told her to stay out of the woods and just be careful because children are going missing. Well, here underground, they saw him. They saw the principal. And then they saw him sort of move and shift and shed the skin, and he was one of the lizard people underneath it. They were desperately trying to get out of the tunnel when they turned around behind them. Hildegard took out her toy plastic lightsaber and lit it up to give them some light, when all of a sudden the same lizard that had once been wearing the fake skin of their principal jumped out of the shadows, hissing and roaring. And that was the end of episode 2 for them. So that's going to be exactly where we pick it up whenever we start in with our 3rd session. As far as some of the things to keep in mind if you're going to GM Tales from the Loop from this episode of Roll for Initiative, really look at that extended trouble. And it would be my suggestion that once per session, find a way to work that in. It's sort of the big climactic moment. And I think of my Tales from the Loop sessions as one episode of the season of the show as we go. And this season of Tales from the Loop for my players will probably last 4 or 5 episodes. So they've got about 3 sessions left. We're building towards that one big moment. It's the thing that they really do need to overcome. And if they don't, there are real consequences. And that's what led to the quote-unquote boss fight that they had with the door that was really tense and really satisfying when they passed it. Now, I don't usually end a session with that extended trouble. I let things play on a little bit afterwards. Also, don't undervalue the use of a cliffhanger, especially if you're going to structure some of your shorter sessions, like my Tales ones. They're only about 3 or 4 hours, short for us. The use of the cliffhanger can be pretty nice, and it gives you a real good starting point for each session. The cliffhanger from my episode 1 was being found by the search party, but not knowing what was happening next. And then, of course, episode 2, the cliffhanger of the giant lizard person jumping out at them. Have you had a chance to play Tales from the Loop? If you have, let me know what you think about it. Do you like the extended tests? Do you use more than one success require? Do you like to bump it up to 2 sometimes, or do you always stick with the first one? Let me know how you like to play, and let me know what else you think is going on in the game. If you've got some speculation from the first episode and this story recap, then that would be kind of cool. I'll absolutely let you know what the kids are up to the next time we jump into our session. Thanks a lot for joining me. If you liked this, give us a like and a share. Don't forget to subscribe, and you can hit the bell icon in order to get notifications anytime we do our bonus videos, like the shorties we were putting up while we were at Gen Con, or the Gen Con wrap-up, and a lot of our interviews that tend to be bonuses. We don't want you to miss anything, so go ahead and hit subscribe and hit that bell. Our regular episodes come out every Tuesday and Thursday, and we've got a lot of new stuff coming your way. We try to keep the quality really high and bring you as much as we can, and those of you that hop over to Patreon, thank you so much, because that helps immensely in letting Dawn and I bring you more and higher quality videos. So if you haven't checked it out, it might be kind of cool to hop over there. There's a couple of different levels where you can support us, as well as get some cool things sent your way if you'd like to. And that's patreon.com/roll4initiative. That being said, a huge thank you to some of our patrons, including Lainey, to Bryce and Arby, Joan, and Sean. And again, hey Arby, we got to see you at Gen Con. It was really cool to meet you. If you want to get your name thrown into that list, again, go check out our Patreon. But all of our viewers, thank you so much. We love seeing you at conventions. We love reading all of your comments, so keep that coming our way. And I'll talk to you next time on the next Roll for Initiative. Oh boy.